Welcome back to the Chell Sweets kitchen. Today we are making a SpongeBob cake. I used to watch SpongeBob all the time when I was a kid, and I still love him to this day. To make this cake, I'm going to use my vanilla layer cake recipe with some slight modifications. If you guys want to learn how to make this recipe, you can click the link in the upper right corner to watch the tutorial, or the full recipe for this cake is up on chellsweets.com. So SpongeBob obviously lives in a pineapple under the sea, and I really wanted to incorporate pineapple into this recipe. So I took my classic vanilla layer cake recipe, I'm going to bake it in 2 sheet pans, and I'm also going to swap out 1 cup of buttermilk for a cup of pineapple juice, and that's going to give it a little bit of a fruity flavor that I'm after. I then added in some vegetable oil and a little bit of vanilla, and mixed the batter together with a paddle attachment until it was nice and smooth. One thing to note, pineapple juice is a lot thinner than buttermilk, so this batter is going to be thinner than my normal vanilla cake batter. Another important tip I have for baking sheet cakes is using a flour nail. This is going to help the layers bake more evenly and quickly by placing them upside down and evenly spaced in the center of the pan. It's going to help heat get to the middle of those layers and help them bake better. Just be sure that you spray them with nonstick cooking spray to make sure that they easily pop out once your cake layers are baked. So as you're pouring in your batter, they might shift around a little bit, and that's totally fine. You can reposition them before you pop the layers into the oven. Just be sure to split your batter evenly between both of your cake pans. I recommend using a digital scale to make sure that your batter is evenly divided. It just makes life a lot easier. It's also a good idea to bang your pans on the counter before popping them in the oven to get out any air bubbles. While my cake layer is baked, I also made a pineapple simple syrup. So to make this, I just use equal parts pineapple juice and sugar. And we're going to heat this until it comes to a boil, which is going to dissolve all that sugar. Once my cake layers were baked and cooled, I flipped them over and carefully removed my flour nails. So you can just pop it up with your finger and it should come right out. Next, it was time to level our cake layers. While my vanilla layer cake recipe bakes pretty flat, there still is a little bit of a mound, and since we're going to be building such a tall cake, I really wanted each layer to be super level. It just makes it easier to build a structurally sound cake. So to trim this top layer, I'm using a serrated knife, and I'm not applying a lot of pressure. I'm just trying to trim away any bits that seem higher than the edge of the cake layer. Next, it was time to cut this sheet cake into 3 different pieces. So I got out a ruler and made some score marks just to make sure that they were all the exact same size. And I did that on both sides to make sure that my lines were nice and straight. Once I was comfortable cutting into the cake, I cut this into 3 separate pieces and repeated the process with my second cake layer. Speaking of structurally sound cakes, I poked some holes in my thick cake drum that I'm going to insert my supports into to make sure that they're nice and anchored. I'm also adding a very generous amount of frosting to my cake board to help my cake layer stick in place as I build the cake. And then it was time to start building SpongeBob. So I put down my first cake layer, I brushed it with a very generous amount of our pineapple simple syrup, and once I felt like my layer was pretty thoroughly soaked, I added some yellow buttercream. So this is just my classic American buttercream mixed with a little bit of yellow gel food coloring. So I'm adding a generous amount of buttercream because I'm a big frosting fan, and I also wanted to add some sprinkles just because SpongeBob is so fun. It felt very fitting. And then I repeated this process all the way up the cake. So like I mentioned earlier, SpongeBob is built with 6 cake layers, and it took a bit of time to stack him up. Once I got to the 4th layer, he started to feel a little bit wiggly, so I was very careful as I was spreading the frosting. And as soon as I had all of my layers stacked, I inserted 2 bubble tea straws into the cake. It's really important that you have some kind of support in this cake because you're going to have to transfer it in and out of the fridge as you decorate, and there's a chance that he could fall over without them. My straws were a little bit too tall, so I just trimmed them with some scissors and then topped off the cake with some more frosting. Next, it was time for the crumb coat. So I added a bit of frosting all the way around the cake and then began to spread it with my large offset spatula. I also realized as I was doing this that SpongeBob's shape just seemed a little bit off. He was a bit too wide, so I ended up actually trimming away about 1.5 inches of cake from the side. You can see there's a little preview of the inside of our cake, but now he looks a little bit more rectangular and less square. So keep this in mind as you do this. You can either use a different shaped pan, you can add more frosting between the layers, or you can just make more cake layers. So I chilled SpongeBob after his crumb coat was all ready to go and he was fully covered, and then I added a very generous second layer of frosting here. So to really get SpongeBob's shapes and kind of the curves along his sides and all that texture that we're after, you have to add a lot of frosting. So I made a double batch of frosting for this cake, and it's not actually that big of a cake, but I used all of it. So if you plan to recreate this cake, I highly recommend making a lot of frosting and having a bit of extra on hand just in case. So to create his sides, I started by piping the frosting in a bit of a squiggly pattern. I then filled in with a small offset spatula between the lines that I had piped, kind of like an outline. And then I used my acetate sheet to smooth things. And on any type of sculpted cake, even though this is almost kind of a rectangle cake, it makes it so much easier to work with using an acetate sheet. So highly recommend it. I get mine on Amazon, and I'll include the link in the video description below. Once I was satisfied with how smooth SpongeBob was, I added his shirt. So I just piped some white buttercream underneath that yellow, and I then added some chocolate buttercream to make his pants. So his proportions really are strange, and his pants and his shirt are such a small fraction of his body. So it looks a little strange there, but I promise it's gonna look good in the end. I also used my leftover cake scraps, some chocolate buttercream, and a bit of black gel food coloring to make some very creepy cake pop-esque balls, and these are going to turn into SpongeBob's shoes. I shaped them over some bubble tea straws to give them some structure, and then I froze them. While those were chilling, I began to work on SpongeBob's facial features. So my goal with this cake really was to make as much of it out of buttercream as possible, but for his facial features, I really felt like I needed to use fondant to get them right. So I started off with my black fondant and created the outline for his eyes, his eyelashes, his nose, and his mouth. And then I went to work on his pupils and his blue irises. Next, it was time to cut out his teeth and also add some fun cheeks above his smile. I also cut out his tie and made some thin stripes for his tube socks. And even though his face looks a little bit weird against this cutting board, I promise it's going to look normal once we get it on the cake. So once those had firmed up a little bit and they were easier to handle, I began to add them to the cake. So first I added his tie, then I used a bit of buttercream to add his eyes on. Next was his nose, which I had to reshape a little bit, and I also had to cut down his teeth. I cut them way too large the first time. And once his face was in place, I began to work on everything else. So I used a bit of buttercream to create his pant legs, and some white buttercream to make his sleeves. Again, sticking with our buttercream theme, I used some yellow buttercream to make his arms and his hands, and of course his legs. He looks kind of messed up without his socks on here, and I had to remove a little bit of the yellow buttercream I piped to make room for his socks. So I piped some white buttercream at the end of his legs, and then added those fondant stripes to create his tube socks. Then the final piece was his shoes. So these had firmed up nicely, and I was able to easily place them right on the cake board. So the last thing I needed to do was give SpongeBob some holes. To do this, I heated up a small baby spoon with some hot water, dried it off, and then carefully carved out tiny little holes. I really love this technique because it gives you a 3D look, but this is also why it's important that you add a very thick second layer of frosting. So having the spoon be a little bit warm makes it so much easier to do this, and I also chilled the cake so it was almost like I was carving out those little holes. I highly recommend this method. It was a lot of fun and really gives such a great finished look. Normally I'm very eager to cut into my cakes, but this one was hard for me. I just love the way he turned out and he was so cute, and I really did feel bad cutting into him. But it had to be done. We had to try those pineapple cake layers, and it also was fun to cut into him because he has such a pretty cross section because he's made with so many cake layers. So thanks so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this SpongeBob cake tutorial. Don't forget, if you want to recreate this cake, the recipe is up on chellsweets.com. So enjoy, and hopefully I'll see you guys again soon.